IVM.
Paying your credit card bills on time is a great policy, and Cred rewards you for doing that. Just pay your bills on Cred and stand the chance to win some amazing prizes, rewards, cashback, and a whole lot more. So don't miss out, just download Cred.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to another episode of All Things Policy from the Takshashila Institution. I am Ruturaj and I will be steering today's conversation along with Manoj and Suyash. Manoj is our resident China expert. He focuses on Chinese politics, foreign policy, and approaches to new technologies. While Suyash is part of the Takshashila Institution's China Studies program, and he focuses on China's defense and foreign policies. Now, Manoj and Suyash are with me because the topic warrants their presence. The topic, of course, is about recent developments that came to a head with certain undiplomatic tweets from certain ministers from Philippine government. What I'm talking about is, of course, the presence of Chinese shipping in exclusive economic zone, which is also claimed by Philippines. And the tweets that were undiplomatic and created a bit of interest all over the world were from a Chinese diplomat, or rather minister. And at the heart of that was a message that Philippines is feeling betrayed by CCP. And though Philippines has made certain friendly gestures, TCP has not reciprocated in equal jest. As we will discuss, Philippines and US have gone ahead with certain military exercises, and also Philippines has asked US to supply it with new COVID vaccines, though initially it had taken deliveries from China. So there are certain developments on the relationship between Philippines and US as well, and maybe we can attribute these things to the presence of Chinese in the Western Philippine Sea. But before that, I would like Suyash to bring everyone up to date about these events, which seem to be a cyclical event and in nature and happen almost every year. And this year is not actually an exception, but the norm.
Thanks, Ruturaj. As you have already rightly pointed out, it's a cyclical event which happens every year. So, and the South China Sea has been largely problematic since almost a decade or more than that now. So, this particular event we are talking about is happening at Witherspoon Reef, which is the northernmost point of Sparkleys, and is claimed by both People's Republic of China and the Philippines. So, because it is claimed by both, what happened this time? This event is happening since mid-March, early March. A lot of vessels were seen. Almost 200 vessels were seen docked in and around the Witherspoon Reef. When this got noticed, a lot of analysts, geostatic analysts, satellite and imaginary analysts identified that these vessels had Chinese hull numbers. Once this came into picture, Philippines raised this issue with China that you are docking almost 200. You are asserting yourself and docking almost 200 vessels at a Philippines claimed region. China responded to this by saying that first they said that these are not Chinese vessels. Then they responded that these are Chinese fishing vessels. They are there because of the choppiness of the South China Sea, and they are just taking shelter there unless the waters are choppy. But it's over 45 days now, and it's already been proven that waters are not choppy, but still they were there for a very long period. Now they have dispersed, but are in the same. Some of the vessels are in the same region. To add on to this, it was later identified that some of the hull numbers of the 200 ships, at least 15 to 20 or more than that ships, were not only fishing trawlers, but some of them were related to Chinese maritime militia. So every ship has a hull number, and based on that hull number, you could identify which service this ship belongs to. Generally, you can identify that. For rogue ships, you cannot. So it was identified that at least 15 to 20 ships were belonging to Chinese maritime militia. I'm sure later in the course of this discussion, we can talk about Chinese maritime militia's role in the South China Sea. So this was raised by Philippines to China. Philippines raised a diplomatic protest to China. China dismissed it. As a reaction, Philippines started maritime patrolling over there, not only using boats but vessels, but also aircraft. And then this tug of war started, which is still happening in the region. And then a lot of external players got involved. As you've pointed out, US got involved, Southeast Asian, ASEAN countries got involved. And this diplomatic standoff has protracted over a certain period of time.
I think Suyash has laid out exactly what's been happening for the last 2 months or so. I think if you were to go back to the statement that the Philippine side put out in the last 48 hours, they essentially talk about how some of this has been taking place since January. They talk about how, from 1st January to 18th March, we've seen, maritime law enforcement agencies monitoring what they say is unauthorized presence by hundreds of Chinese vessels in the West Philippine Sea region. And I think that's so it's a longer duration, but the Whitsun Reef thing has come up obviously since March, and it's become a serious sore point between the two sides. From what we understand is that once some of this became a bigger deal, you saw the Chinese vessels dissipate a little bit. They went away, but they spread out across the sort of Stratlys, and those tensions are still continuing. There have been a couple of cases where Filipino journalists have been blocked from going there. Filipino fishermen, of course, have been blocked. There have also been instances of, there have been sort of allegations of threats from each side. There is this, there are videos that will showcase, threats being issued to different vessels while they're in the waters. So it just tells you a little bit about the nature of tensions on the sea and how difficult it can be and how easily the situation can escalate. I think it's important to place all of this in the context of the broader relationship between the Philippines and China. What we've seen ever since Rodrigo Duterte took charge is a turn in how the Philippines approaches China. It has, Duterte in particular has been very, very complimentary. He's, and while being complimentary and while trying to deepen the sort of economic relationship, in which he's not the only person in that region to try and do that. Everybody has sought to try and gain from China's economic rise. But at the same time, he sought to downplay any territorial disputes that they've had with China. So after he took charge, he downplayed the Hague Tribunal verdict in 2016, which which was a case between the Philippines and China, where the Chinese essentially said that we don't recognize the tribunal's jurisdiction in this case, and they didn't participate in it. But yet, the Hague Tribunal vote, when it in its eventual award of the arbitration, it largely supported the Philippines case in the sense that it told us that the Chinese claim of historical rights over the South China Sea and islands and features in the South China Sea does not stand scrutiny. It does not have basis in international law. And the Chinese argument is this, that, the 9-line which is drawn is based on China's historical sovereignty over this region. And the Hague Tribunal essentially said that does not stand. It also identified certain reefs and certain features which do lie within the Philippine EEZ, and therefore, the Philippines has a legitimate claim to make when it says that the Chinese are acting in their zone. So I think Duterte, when he came to power, he essentially underplayed all of this, and he focused on economic engagement with China along with appeasement, to the degree where when he was pushed domestically that, why aren't you raising some of these issues with the Chinese? His argument would be, what's the point of raising them? Do you want to enter into a war with Beijing? And that's the real false dichotomy, because at the end of the day, you don't need to have war, if you have to just make your claims. You can make your claims without it being, without it ending up in conflict and war. And I think it's a real, it was a misplaced argument. But the fact that he made that argument to try and silence critics in Philippines tells you that there are critics not just within the political establishment, but also within the government and across different ministries. So Duterte sort of tried to move away a little bit from the US and the traditional treaty alliance that they have with the US. Yet the defense establishment in the Philippines continued to maintain a strong link with the defense establishment in the US, and exercises and drills and equipment deals, etc., have continued. And this continues even today. And again, what we're seeing today in the last sort of few days, where we've seen the Philippines Foreign Secretary issue that tweet, which was abusive and attacking Beijing, he eventually deleted that tweet. But After he issued that tweet, there was a response from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which said, which basically asked him to mind his basic manners and act in a way that suits his status. But it also the Chinese Foreign Ministry also spoke about Duterte's statement after this particular incident, in which Duterte said that China remains our benefactor. Just because we have a conflict with China does not mean that we have to be rude and disrespectful. And the Chinese side sort of acknowledged that. What the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement tells us is that fair enough, you got angry, but we're not going to change how we behave. There's no reason for us to. So I see this sort of tension domestically in the Philippines continuing, and we will also likely to see tensions in the waters continuing for some time to come.
Thanks, Manoj, in bringing out the intricacies that are involved in Philippines when it comes to dealing with China as well as US. Now, Suyash, you mentioned that the phenomenon of Chinese shipping, be it Chinese fishing vessels or maritime militia vessels coming into South China Sea, is almost a yearly phenomenon. But generally, this happens in the fishing season, which you have mentioned in the other articles to be in June or July. But this time, the incursions, if I can use the word, happened much earlier, as early as April or even before that. Can we attribute any significance to the change in timing of Chinese activities?
So this, as you've already pointed out, Ruturaj, this is cyclical. It happens every year, but generally it happens in June and July. But there were aberrations in the past. For example, last year itself, Chinese became very active in the South China Sea in March, April, May, June. In fact, Manoj, I and our colleague Aditya have a document on this, which you can find on Takshashila's website regarding it's titled South China Sea's Pandemic Opportunism. So a lot of activities happen generally in June, July, but this could be an aberration because I'm just speculating it in blind. This could be an aberration because new administration is in power right now in the US. This could be one way of testing them, as in what are their responses, how are they dealing with such a situation. And two, we also have to think it in a broader perspective that suddenly this incident has not happened in the South China Sea. As Manoj already pointed out, there were some actions happening in the region since January. Also, US has become very active in the region since Biden came to power. Also, Japan, France, a lot of extra regional forces have become active in the region. So this could be one way of asserting itself. This could be not. This is one way of asserting itself. There is no need of particularly pointing out a timing. This could be one aberration of going forward. But yes, these are cyclical events and happen and are happening throughout this decade. It just happened in April instead of July. This is the difference this time.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of slightly disagree with that. I mean, I wouldn't call them cyclical. I would call them that these happen on a regular basis, and the purpose for these taking place is essentially the desire from Beijing to use might to change the status quo in the waters, and to be able to, in some ways, browbeat neighbors into accepting Chinese positions. So, and you do that by firstly projecting force and also by changing the facts on the ground. And we've seen this over the last decade and a half, where you've seen not just force projection, you've seen incidents where ships have banged into each other. You've seen some tragic loss of life. You've also seen, in some ways, building of artificial islands and then militarization of some of these islands. So I think it's a part of a pattern. And therefore, I wouldn't call it cyclical. I would call it a part of a pattern in which China is sort of exerting its control and gradually strengthening its control in this part, in the South China Sea. In terms of, the how others have reacted, I mean, I don't see this necessarily as something which is specifically related to the Biden administration, or because the Biden administration has become much more active in the South China Sea. I see it as, again, from a Chinese point of view, there has been activity in the South China Sea and greater assertion from the US for some time now. I mean, it was under the Trump administration that the policy shifted, formally also, when Pompeo announced that they formally backed the Hague verdict and they announced a shift in the policy. So it's not necessarily a Biden specific issue. What's happened is that the Biden administration has continued with the policies of the Trump administration with regard to the South China Sea and in general so far with regard to China, while also amplifying, sort of plugging in the loopholes that existed, which was with regard to how the US administration under Trump was working with allies and partners. I mean, I think the recent sort of quote by Anthony Blinken during the G7 meetings, where he talks about the fact that, individually, the US is 25% of the world's GDP, putting pressure on China. But collectively, with allies and partners, you're 50, 60, 70% of the GDP. Can China sort of ignore that kind of might when it comes together? So I think that tells you a little bit about the shift in the Biden administration's policies. But I don't think in terms of its actual actions so far on the ground in South China Sea, we've seen a significant shift from the Trump administration. It's continued that policy, or the change that Trump had made or that Pompeo had announced. And it's continued with freedom of navigation operations. The first freedom of navigation operation under Biden was on the 5th of February. And since then, there have been more. There have been larger vessels in the region. And so have the Chinese. The Chinese have sort of tried to also exert much more influence in the region. So there's a bit of a game of jockeying for position that's playing out. And there's a bit of a game where the Chinese are re-emphasizing their preponderance in that part of the world, saying this is part of our territory.
Thanks, Manoj. I would like to ask you another question. Thing is that these events, this year's event in the Pitsun Reef, as well as you mentioned, other events that happen every year, generally send the Western media as well as certain parts of Indian media into a tizzy. But how does the Chinese media cover such incidences? Is it a newsworthy issue for them? Or are these issues just are limited to the strategic circles of China?
No, of course it's newsworthy, right? I mean, if you think of it from this point of view, if you talk about South China Sea as a whole, look, this is a part of the world that the Chinese say belongs to it. It's part of China's national territory. So it's a territorial integrity issue. So it's of course going to be something that's going to always remain high on news priority. So developments with regard to South China Sea will always be priority news coverage, particularly with regard to the jostling that's going on between the US and China. In terms of this specific case with the Philippines, we didn't see tremendous coverage over the last few weeks or the last 2 months in Chinese media. There was, of course, coverage, but it was not something like this was the leading story or, so that won't happen. Even today, that's not the case. It's not the leading story. Is it covered across the board? Yes. Predominantly, that coverage is led by, the lines set by the foreign ministry or the defense ministry. And that's how it follows. You will have commentaries about the sort of powers jostling in the region and that sort of stuff. But largely the line will be set on a particular incident, will be set by official statements. And you won't necessarily deviate too much from that. So you won't necessarily talk about, different bits of coverage and different ideas. So the line will be followed. Even if you cover how the Western media is covering this, you will at the end of the sort of be critical of that coverage and you will say, this is what the Chinese position is. And of course, historically, this is Chinese territory, because the whole frame of reference will be of territorial integrity, which is not to be compromised. So I think that's how the media generally covers this. From a strategic point of view, if you think of it, this is about the rise of China. And there's a wonderful book by Pooja Bhatt on the 9-dash line. And, and in that she sort of essentially makes this argument, and I agree with her argument, is that these claims that the Chinese are making and its expression of, gaining space with regard to these claims by using force calibratedly is about beyond just territorial integrity. It's also about the idea of China being the preponderant Asian power. And I think that is something, we need to keep in mind, that this is not just about this belongs to me. This is also about this belongs to me and I am the big dog here. And I think it's about emphasizing that.
Thanks, Manoj. Now, Suyash, you have recently written a few articles and have been researching about the Chinese maritime militia as well as the Chinese Coast Guard. Now, in these events where the Chinese send a series of ships into different areas of South China Sea, the maritime militia is always at the front. But I guess the Chinese Coast Guard also supports them in a way. And in one of your recent articles, you mentioned about new laws that the Chinese Communist Party has enacted, which allows the Coast Guard certain powers, and according to analysis, this increases chance of escalation. So can you sort of tie all these three things? Like, would the new laws and this particular incident would lead to any escalation, or the Coast Guard is not really involved in such activities?
For now, Coast Guards are not involved, at least from what we can see right now, only maritime vessels, but I'm sure Coast Guards are around or would be there in this place. But at least for now, maritime militias are identified in the region. So these are the three different structures of force that China operates for territorial disputes. One is the PLA, second one is the Coast Guard, which comes under the PAP, which is paramilitary forces, and third one is the maritime militia. These are tools used for different gradations of escalation. So, for example, the weaponry that is involved, that the PLA involves, PLA is high-tech weaponry. Maritime militia will comparatively have comparatively low-tech or relatively low-tech weaponry and relatively low-tech powers that they have been confined by the CMC as compared to PLA. And similarly, if you talk about militia, militia will have a small vessel or a medium-type vessel along with one or two guns. Generally, China in the South China Sea region uses maritime militia to assert itself. Why they use maritime militia? Because this is a gray area where the escalation can be one, they can claim that they are not our militias if there is an escalation. Two, because the armies are not involved, escalation is confined to a particular threshold. So there is no unchecked escalation happening because of militia, which would happen if the PLA gets involved. Now, regarding the Coast Guard, the new law that has been passed, there are some things that are unique to China, but not to other states. For example, four important things are to be highlighted in three or four important things are to be highlighted in the Coast Guard law. One, use of firearms. The China is saying that Coast Guards could use firearms in whatever situation they think it is deemed necessary. Two, they are saying that they have powers to aboard the vessel and confiscate arms if required. So this they are not specifying in which region. They are saying that in China's EEZ. Now China claims the entire 9-dash line, the region within the entire 9-dash line, or their EEZ within different man-made islands. So would that mean that China would be doing similar things that they are doing in their mainland EEZ here? And this would be escalated because there are a lot of other actors involved here. But these are not only unique to China, because Vietnam has also passed previous laws, certain laws like this before. So Vietnam also have similar laws. So these are not only unique to China, but this is some sort of symbolism. But certain laws like use of firearm could have an impact on the region and could have escalatory potential going into the future. But right now, Coast Guards are not involved. Only for now, from what we can identify right now, only maritime militia is involved in this region at the Witspoon dispute.
Okay. So, Suyash, continuing from the last question, you mentioned that the use of Chinese maritime militia is a very clever grey tactic, because this allows the Chinese to play the victim card, because very few countries have certain organizations on the line of maritime militia. So the first response of another nation is either a coast guard or a naval vessel. And in this scenario, then the China gets the chance to play the victim card. So is there any way to counter this? I know Vietnam has a maritime militia, which is of course very small in terms of number of ships and personnel. But do you have anything in mind to, sort of counter this very sly tactic?
I would slightly disagree with the question that the framing of the question. I wouldn't say that they would be playing victim card due to this, but it helps them to assert their claims into the region, and also helps them to do certain things which the conventional forces cannot do without it being termed as escalatory. I'll give you an example. For example, if a US ship or a Japanese ship is sailing through the vessel is sailing through the region, China and the region which is claimed by China. So Chinese militia can obviously harass those vessels, or could stop those vessels, or could target those vessels, or could give warnings to them. But similar things which are, if done by PLA, would have escalatory potential. So that is how they use these vessels. I'm not sure what could be a response to this. Maybe because a lot of scholars are working on how to counter Chinese maritime militia. One response which Philippines themselves are doing right now, and which Vietnam has done, is they are creating a fleet of their own militia. So Vietnam recently I think there was a news last week that Vietnam is increasing the size of militia. They are increasing to 20,000 militia, which would be a significant number in asserting their region. So I think that is one way of dealing with Chinese maritime militia, but I am not sure what are the other ways of dealing with Chinese maritime militia. There is a certain gap which needs to be identified, that how conventional forces in the region and the extra regional forces would deal with the militia activities by certain countries.
I think we can learn some lessons from, essentially, look, this is what the maritime militia is. It's fundamentally state controlled. It's fundamentally, armed and, directed by organs of the state. Yet it allows you that deniability, right? It allows you the deniability to be able to say, well, look, this is not the Chinese government force or anything like that. And these are fishermen or these are, private entities, whatever. Yeah, they may be Chinese, but they are private entities and so on and so forth. So it allows you that deniability like you guys have spoken about. Think of this in the context of, and this is a bit of an escalation in the comparison, but think of it in the context of state-sponsored violent actors, your terrorists, your extremists, and this sort of kind of entities, where there is now the links between states and these actors might be tenuous, might not be as clear as, say, they are with regard to the maritime militia in China, where there is a clear chain of command with regard to, what the authorities want. And terrorist groups might have much more looser networks with state authorities, albeit those networks will exist. How do you counter that as vis-a-vis this? One of the ways to, and it's a challenge, right? I mean, in India, we've been dealing with this challenge of how do you deal with state-sponsored terrorism? And we've tried different things. We've tried, one of the things that we've tried is escalation, where you escalate and raise the cost of that particular action. And I think that's fundamentally what will need to happen. Now, the challenge is that there is such an asymmetry between China and other actors in the region that escalation can prove very costly, which is essentially what Duterte was trying to say when he was saying, we'll end up in war. But I think there has to be a certain amount of calibrated escalation that has to take place for this to stop. There is obviously a risk of that escalation to spiral, and nobody would want that. But unless you are going to do that, you are not going to find yourself in a position that you can resist or push back. So there has to be a certain amount of calibrated escalation. If you think of what India does on the border with China, particularly in the last year when you saw, the only point of time where we were able to get a serious negotiation is when India escalated. And the escalation was in the format of, picking up heights along the Kailash range. I think a similar sort of approach in that part of the world is needed, where you need to escalate, you need to create options. Now, it's a very different terrain. I'm not saying that I have the answer of where you pick these options, but at least from a sort of strategic approach, that is what one would need to do, is to be able to display willingness to escalate for Beijing to be able to push back. And I think that's the only way you can do it. And that begins by firstly not buying the argument that the maritime militia is not part of the state machinery, and that's the first thing. And I think most states are sort of buying that argument, even though the Chinese keep denying it. I mean, even the most recent incident at the Whitsun Reef, we've seen the Chinese basically say that there is no maritime militia. This was the Chinese embassy in Manila. So I think we need to think of it in that context. And maybe that's when you can start identifying what are the actions that you need to take on the ground to be able to escalate. What are your options to be able to escalate? Because without that, I don't think you're going to sort of see behavior from Beijing change.
Thanks, Manoj, for this insight. I just have a slightly ignorant question. So when you said the Chinese embassy in Manila said there are no militia, were you referring to that the Chinese government not acknowledging the presence of militia at all, existing the presence at all, or existence of militia in Western Philippines Sea?
So when the Chinese embassy in Manila was asked specifically about this, they issued a statement. This is from late March this year. And it says that it has taken note of the recent remarks from the Philippines side about the presence of alleged Chinese maritime militia vessels. It says that there is no Chinese maritime militia as alleged. Any speculation in such helps nothing but causes unnecessary irritation. it is hoped the situation could be handled in an objective and rational manner. So it's basically saying that there is none of this that exists. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that they will continue to deny it, but we know that it exists, and therefore the only way to do it is to be able to escalate.
Thanks, Suyash and Manoj, for this wonderful discussion. You brought out the nuances of the Philippines' relationship with China and US, as well as you shed light on the exact things that were happening in the South China Sea, and also pointed out that this is a regular pattern that happens almost every year and part of the larger Chinese strategy. So, dear listeners, if you liked today's episode of All Things Policy, please follow other podcasts of Takshashila Institution on the IBM website.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Cied, TheWholeTruthFoods.com, and PayPal. We really appreciate your support. So this week on Cyrus Says, Cyrus had some interesting guests. Kewalramani was on to talk about his new Netflix film, and Mayur Tekchandani has made a new coffee table book about the city of Mumbai, which he came to discuss on the show. On the Wire Talk, Siddharth Bhatia was joined by Dr. Ali Khan Mahmoodabad to talk about the Muslim community's issues during these thorny times. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor is joined by Sonia Jas to talk about the importance of fitness and why this is a great time to begin a journey to good health. The Simplified Gang has reunited and they discuss the hue and cry around the European Super League that was eventually just dropped after 2 days. On Shunya One, Shilith and I are talking to Gurubat from PayPal India. We talk about fintech, the future of digital payments, and a whole lot more. Really deep and interesting conversation about PayPal, its plans in India, and what kind of hiring they're looking to do. On The Millennial Athlete, Tanvi and Shlok were joined by sport and performance psychologist Dr. Shri Advani to talk about mental health for young sports stars. And I just want to again mention some of our cricket shows you should definitely check out, Edges and Sledges. And we also have a Hindi show called Khel Niti. Do check that out as well. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
If you love cricket, listen up. The Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast is here for you. Hosted by DJ, Varun, and me, Ashwin, we bring a fun, fresh fan's point of view to talking all things cricket. Sometimes it's just the three of us, sometimes we have guests, including current and former international cricketers. For new episodes every week, check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast on the IBM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.